It is often the case that Zoomers lament the state of their generation and their society. This is not done without good reason, as we discussed in the previous video. But speaking as a Zoomer myself, perhaps the only generation dealt a worse hand than Gen Z is Generation Alpha. Through no fault of their own, Generation Alpha has had their neurological development stunted during their most formative years. They have been condemned to grow up in dystopian environments in which no child deserves to be raised, and the consequences of being raised in these environments are most dire for Gen Alpha's well-being. Perhaps some people would scoff at my usage of the word dystopian to describe the conditions in which Gen Alpha are being raised. They would likely accuse me of being hyperbolic and exaggerating how bad the situation is for Gen Alpha kids. To these people, I would retort that they are woefully ignorant of how bad things really are. The grim reality is that no other generation in history has had screens placed before their eyes since they were in the cradle. No other generation has been locked in their homes, forced to wear masks, and been deprived of social interaction under the auspices of social distancing like Generation Alpha has. No other generation has had their entire lives be put on social media for all of the world to see since their childhood, like Generation Alpha has. No other generation has been raised in such a hypersexualized and morally bankrupt culture as Gen Alpha has. And most horrifically of all, no other generation has been exposed to pornographic material as early as Generation Alpha has. When we honestly look at the culture in which Generation Alpha was raised, it becomes hard to judge them for their generation's maladies. We see the youth using brain rot slang like skibbity toilet, giat, and no cap on God, and rightfully feel disgusted by this, but it is important to remember that Generation Alpha is merely repeating whatever is put in front of them on a screen. Generation Alpha had no say in being given iPads before they could even talk, and it is not their fault that the content they are fed is degenerate. From a scientific perspective, the brain is not fully developed until the mid-20s, and the negative effects of things like iPad use, TikTok, or pornography cannot be overemphasized. The short attention spans, screen addictions, brain rot slang, cluelessness, and degeneracy of Generation Alpha is something that was inflicted upon them, not produced by them. Unfortunately, screens and degenerate content are not the only things that have wrecked Generation Alpha's neurology. As I have mentioned, the COVID lockdowns and mask mandates also robbed Gen Alpha of necessary developmental milestones. Children were deprived of social interaction with their peers and could not go play outside. It is also important for children to see their parents' and teachers' mouths move as part of their linguistic development. And throughout COVID, these children were forced to wear masks and saw everyone around them wearing masks for 2 to 3 years. Exacerbating this problem is the fact that all the while as this was happening, Gen Alpha had screens in front of their eyes and they were imbibing brain rot content by influencers like Jake and Logan Paul and Kai Cenat. It is no wonder why rather than talking like normal human beings, Gen Alpha kids incessantly say things like skibbity toilet. 2020 America was a dystopia, and Generation Alpha is illustrating the consequences of lockdowns on children. They were not given a fair chance to develop, and we are seeing what this does. A third key factor to mention on the topic of why Gen Alpha is the way that it is has to do with the social engineering that Western countries have been subjected to. Just as we discussed in the previous video, while Western populations have been deracinated from ethnic and religious identity, the dominant culture of the United States promotes materialism, debauchery, and sexual degeneracy. It spurns any exhibition of white identity while praising black culture and putting it on a pedestal. The anti-white animus against Europeans and European diaspora has been present in society for decades, and merely ramped into overdrive in the most recent of years. Gen Alpha is already the most ethnically diverse generation in American history, and the suppression of racial and religious identity, coupled with indoctrination in state schools, means that Generation Alpha is woefully unequipped to navigate the modern landscape. Each of these aforementioned problems are but a sample of what is wrong with Generation Alpha, and likewise, each of these problems has been foisted onto Gen Alpha rather than created of their own making. This is why whenever I see Gen Alpha kids doing something stupid or cringe, my first response is to pity them. But having come to understand the plight of Gen Alpha, the question remains as to what can be done for them. On this question, I am not as black-pilled as many of my contemporaries. The first prescription I would give is to get these children out of state schools. They are being taught gutter information in these indoctrination daycares, and if parents are seriously concerned for their well-being, they will find a way to homeschool them. In America, homeschooling is fortunately legal, and excuses for not homeschooling, such as, "but both parents need to work," must be discarded entirely. The child's well-being must be prioritized above all. Secondly, the parents must instill in the child the knowledge that modern society is one in decline. The dominant culture is degenerate and shuns religion and racial identity. Thus, the parents must ingrain healthy counterculture values into their kids. Thirdly, parents must regulate screen use amongst each of the children. I do not agree with the Luddite solution of no technology whatsoever, as doing this will hobble children whenever they grow old enough to enter the real world. Rather, a far better solution is to be involved and teach children proper internet safety, and to keep a watchful eye and protect them from degenerate content. These are but some rudimentary and simple steps to fixing Gen Alpha if you are a prospective parent. The reason I am not black-pilled about Gen Alpha is that they are still young enough to learn, and are not set in their ways like Zoomers and Millennials have become. With a guiding hand and a vigilant eye protecting them and raising them correctly, there is fortunately still time to shape Gen Alpha kids into intelligent and virtuous adults. They can still become high-quality human capital, even though they started with a terrible hand.